From the chariots of ancient warfare to today's most sophisticated armored cars, wheeled vehicles have given mobility to warfare. This video ordnance program examines the latest technology in wheeled armored vehicles. Although tanks are better known, wheeled armored cars are the oldest form of armored vehicles. At the turn of the century, armored steam traction engines were used by the British Army during the Boer War. The First World War saw a profusion of armored cars, used by nearly all of the armies in the conflict. These vehicles were little more than conventional automobiles with a thin layer of armor added. They were useful for scouting and raiding, but they were soon overshadowed by the tank. The armored car's wheels are both its greatest asset and its greatest liability. A tank spreads its weight across the broad surface of its track, reducing its ground pressure. An armored car's weight is supported only by the tiny area where its wheels make contact with the ground. For a given weight of vehicle, this means that a tank will be able to traverse mud, snow, and soft ground, where an armored car will become hopelessly bogged down. This problem limited the growth of armored cars before the Second World War. They could not carry as much armor as tracked tanks, so they were used mainly for scouting missions, where they could stay on roads or hard ground. World War II saw innovations such as the addition of more wheels to reduce the ground pressure problem. Another alternative was to add a track assembly in the rear of the vehicle, called a half-track. The post-war years saw many innovations in the design of armored cars. The Panhard EBR introduced the idea of supplementary wheels. The two pairs of wheels in the center of the vehicle are kept in elevated position when high speed is desired, but when mud is encountered, the wheels can be depressed to give better traction. This method was also used on vehicles such as the Soviet BRDM-2, which has added pairs of wheels hidden in the hull. Another method to reduce ground pressure is to increase the surface area of the tire. This can be done by removing air from the tire, giving it a greater footprint on the ground. On the Soviet BTR-152, the driver controls these tubes to inflate or deflate the tires depending on the terrain conditions. Another innovation was run-flat tires. They can be punctured, but still retain enough integrity to allow the vehicle to continue to move. Today, wheeled armored vehicles remain restricted in weight by limitations of wheels. No armored cars are as heavily armored as tanks. But within these limits, armored cars have flourished. Their profusion is due to their economy and their mobility.
I think track vehicles do have that better cross-country mobility, but you do pay for it. A track vehicle can cost anything up to 2 to 3 times more than its wheeled counterpart. It is normally better protected and got better firepower, but it is that much heavier. It is very difficult sometimes to compare the two, but generally you get what you pay for. The wheeled vehicles are cheaper and have less protection. The track vehicles are more expensive, not only to buy, but to operate and maintain.
Armored cars are widely used in two roles. They are the successors to ancient cavalry, using their speed and mobility to scout ahead of heavy tank forces and to screen the unprotected flanks of large mobile formations. They're also used by many infantry forces, serving to carry troops into the battle zone under the cover of armor, with better cross-country performance than trucks and other armored vehicles. The United States Armed Forces provide a good example of the varying attitudes toward wheeled armored vehicles. During the Second World War, the U.S. Army used armored cars such as the M8 Greyhound. But since then, the United States Army has preferred tracked vehicles. Small numbers of V-100 Commando armored cars were used by the US Army military police units during the Vietnam War, but by and large the US Army has rejected wheeled combat vehicles. In spite of this, the United States is one of the largest manufacturers of wheeled armored vehicles. Cadillac Gage, which made the V-100 Commando for the Army during the Vietnam War, has continued to manufacture wheeled armored vehicles for export. The V-100 series was followed by the V-150 series. Among the most important customers for the V-150 armored cars was the Royal Saudi National Guard. The Saudi National Guard used these vehicles during the Gulf War in 1991, and they figured prominently in the crucial Battle of Khafji early in the war. The V-150 has been popular with the National Guard since its main peacetime role was patrolling Saudi Arabia's vast desert border regions. The most remarkable evolution of the Commando series is the new V-600 armored car. The V-600 was designed to offer the firepower of a main battle tank with the simplicity and low cost of an armored car. New advances in automotive technology give vehicles like these excellent cross-country performance as well as much higher road speeds than track vehicles, over 55 miles per hour. The V-600 is armed with a 105mm gun, identical in performance to the gun used on American main battle tanks such as the M60 and the M1 Abrams. The V-600 Commando has far more sophisticated fire controls than previous armored cars, which allows it to fire while on the move. Cadillac Gage also manufactures a less sophisticated wheeled armored vehicle for police and security work. This vehicle was originally called the Ranger, then the Peacekeeper in the US Air Force service. This armored car is used at US Air Force bases for police and patrol work. Many US nuclear power plants also use the Ranger for police and security patrols. It is based on common automotive components and offers protection against small arms fire. The US Marine Corps does not share the US Army's attitude toward wheeled armored vehicles. In the 1980s, the Marines began looking for a light armored vehicle to give their divisions additional mobility. They selected an interesting design manufactured by General Motors of Canada. The Canadian design originated in Switzerland as part of the Piranha family of wheeled armored vehicles. The Swiss Movag firm developed a family of wheeled armored vehicles using 4, 6, or 8 wheels, depending on the version. The Movag Piranha family was designed as a state-of-the-art wheeled armored vehicle capable of operating in terrain conditions that would stop many wheeled armored vehicles. The Piranhas can be armed with a variety of weapons, ranging from simple machine gun turrets to elaborate turrets with large caliber tank guns. In the 1970s, the Canadian Army selected the 6-wheeled version of the Piranha family, designating it the Armored Vehicle General Purpose. Different weapon systems were added for different missions. For example, the Cougar fire support vehicle has a turreted 76mm gun. The US Marine Corps selected the 8-wheeled version of the Piranha family. The basic American version of the LAV is the LAV-25. It is armed with a 25mm Bushmaster automatic cannon, the same weapon used on the Army's M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Besides its 3-man crew, the LAV-25 can carry an additional 6 Marines in the rear compartment. The LAV-25 is used for scouting, raiding, and screening operations, where its mobility can best be exploited. The LAV-25s can move in advance of the Marine mechanized formations, hunting out weak points in the enemy positions. It offers the scouts the advantage of armor protection as well as its considerable mobility in most terrain. Besides the basic LAV-25, there are a number of specialized variants. The LAV-AT is a tank hunter fitted with a hammerhead tow missile launcher for engaging hostile tanks. To provide fire support for the marine units, there is a special mortar version armed with an 81mm mortar in the rear compartment. The Marines have also been developing air defense variants, armed with both guns and missiles, to protect forward marine units from air attack. Still in trials, this version is armed with an automatic cannon. The gun is supplemented by Stinger missiles for additional capability against low-flying enemy attack aircraft. The LAV-C² is a command vehicle which carries Marine commanders into the battle area and provides them with sufficient communication equipment to coordinate their units' actions. The LAV units also have their own recovery vehicles to help repair damaged vehicles. The Marine Corps' interest in the LAV was closely tied to its traditional role in American rapid deployment missions overseas. These tasks require a special accent on mobility. This led the Marines to seek a vehicle lightweight enough to be easily moved by air, yet well enough armed to have impact on the modern mechanized battlefield. A specific Marine requirement was the need to have the LAV light enough to be airlifted by the CH-53 Echo Super Stallions. The Super Stallion can lift the LAV for considerable distance, even refueling in mid-air to extend its range. The LAV has also been tested for its suitability for air landing missions. In the late 1980s, tests were conducted using parachute airdrop. It takes quite a set of parachutes to safely land a 12-ton LAV. Another approach to rapid insertion of armored vehicles in a paratrooper landing zone is LAPES, for low-altitude parachute extraction. This was also tested with some success in 1987. The LAV was put to the test in combat during Operation Desert Storm. The conditions in Saudi Arabia, with its hard desert soil, proved well suited to the LAV's wheeled configuration. LAVs were used in many engagements, from the first encounters with the Iraqi forces in the Battle of Khafji in January 1991 to the final assault into Kuwait City in February 1991. In some armies, there has never been any debate over tracked versus wheeled armored vehicles. A clear example has been the South African Defence Force. Although the South African Defence Force does use small numbers of tanks, such as the Olifant, the vast majority of its armored vehicles are wheeled. For a decade, South Africa was involved in conflict along the northwestern border in Namibia with guerrilla forces and the regular armies of Angola and Cuba. South African forces have had to travel hundreds of miles with little technical support to carry out these missions.
The distances covered in operations have been great distances, vast distances. To give you a comparison, the distances covered in operations in Southwest Africa or Northern Southwest Africa and Southern Angola could be compared very favorably to Operation Barbarossa of the Second World War. In other words, we're talking about distances greater than Berlin to Moscow. Obviously, if we're talking about those type of distances, we require vehicles or armored vehicles that are good regarding strategic and tactical mobility. Whereas tracked armored vehicles have to be transported by tank transporters over these distances and thus don't really have the same type of tactical and strategic mobility as that of armored fighting vehicles or wheeled armored fighting vehicles.
South Africa first manufactured the Marmon Harrington armoured car in World War II, which saw extensive use in the North African desert campaigns. In the 1960s, they began production of the Airlant armoured car, based on the French Panhard AML. The Airlants proved to be extremely successful. In a number of skirmishes with Angolan forces, Airlants were able to knock out the more powerful Soviet-manufactured T-55 tanks by exploiting the speed and mobility of the smaller armoured car. The South Africans have favoured wheeled vehicles for their range advantages and economy.
The second advantage that wheeled armoured vehicles have is that they are less dependent and less logistic intensive when compared to similar type tracked vehicles. If we look, for instance, at a tank, it needs a tremendous amount of support in terms of trained personnel, equipment, fuel, ammunition, etc. And it needs replenishment daily. While our locally developed wheeled armoured vehicles has got a typical range of in excess of 800 kilometers per tank of fuel. Due to the role that we use it when we use ammunition at a lower rate than a tank would in a high intensity fight, so we can go further with less, which in turn means that you can get away with less logistical toil per vehicles on the front while using wheeled armoured vehicles.
Their first major armoured vehicle design was the Rattle, designed primarily as a troop carrier. The Rattle is a large vehicle capable of carrying troops as well as a turreted weapon. The Rattles can be fitted with a variety of turreted weapons, including anti-tank missiles and guns. The Rattle is very high off the ground compared to its European counterparts. The South Africans have found that sleek European armoured vehicles riding close to the ground have problems in African conditions. So too have Soviet vehicles used by opposing forces.
They have got certain limitations on terrain, and they have also got the added limitation that it's a very low-profile vehicle, as most of their vehicles are, and in fairly dense undergrowth. You get the situation where the crew of that vehicle isn't able to see over the undergrowth, which is on our vehicle designs not such a critical aspect, because we tend to have a vehicle that has got a slightly higher profile, which gives us better observation over low undergrowth. On that point, the low profile, when used according to East Bloc doctrine, is an advantage, but in African type warfare, and especially if you have to fight over rolling terrain, it tends to be a problem, because the vehicle has a very low roof, and in order to declinate the weapon far enough to be able to engage a target on the front, it has to just about totally expose itself, which makes it an easy target for the attacking force.
The most ambitious South African armoured vehicle to date has been the Rooikat. The Rooikat is intended to replace the older Airland armoured cars. The South Africans have a different conception of contemporary warfare than European armies due to their past combat experiences. They distinguish two general types of combat: high mobility operation and high intensity operations. High mobility operations involve combat with enemy forces which are widely dispersed and often lightly armed. This type of combat was the predominant form of engagement with the Angolan and Cuban forces in past wars.
The Rooikat, compared to, let's say, the Rattle 90, which is also featured here, is a better vehicle in the sense that its suspension is much better, that it's got a fire control system, the weapon is better, the commander's got more input into the crew, although he's part of the crew. All in all, a better vehicle, better mobility, better firepower, better armor protection for that matter. And using it in the field, it feels so much better than the older vehicles which are used in previous border excursions. But so I think if we would use this, it would be an excellent vehicle to use.
The Roykat's armament is a stabilized 76mm gun. This is lighter than the guns found on current European armored cars. But the South Africans have found that such weapons are more than adequate for the types of enemy vehicles they're typically engaged in past wars. Wars in Africa usually involve formations of light armored vehicles. Heavy tank formations are far less common than in European or Mid-Eastern armies. South African armored vehicle designs like the Roykat incorporate special features to help reduce their vulnerability to landmines. They can continue to operate even after one or more wheels have been destroyed. The South Africans have also designed special vehicles such as the Buffel, primarily configured for operations where mines are widespread. This is due to their experiences with mines in past battles.
At one stage in 1978, we used to have mine incidences on an average of between 40 and 70 mines per month in the operational area, which is, to our way of thinking, a tremendous lot of mines. Secondly, the mines were beginning to deny us mobility for fighting vehicles, as well as disrupting us logistic supply lines to the fighting vehicles. A wheeled armored vehicle doesn't have the weight advantage or the thick belly armor that the tank has. So in most instances, a landmine would destroy a wheeled armored vehicle. So in order to prevent this, you either slope the belly, like we did on some of our vehicles, or you provide the vehicle with a ground clearance of more than 350 millimeters. Or as a last resort, you can add hardened steel underneath the vehicle. Most of these measures would give a wheeled armored vehicle an adequate survival against conventional mines.
Anti-mine vehicles like the Buffel have special V-shaped armored hulls which divert the landmine blast from the hull. The vehicle might be crippled by the landmine explosion, but the troops inside would survive. There is nothing fancy about these vehicles. They are built from inexpensive automotive components, since ultimately they are expendable. The emphasis is on protecting the troops, not protecting the vehicle itself. The most massive of the South African wheeled armored vehicles is the G6 artillery vehicle. It is a nearly unique type of armored vehicle. With the exception of the Czechoslovak Dana, the G6 is the only large caliber artillery vehicle in the world to use a wheeled configuration instead of tracks. It is designed to work in concert with the many other types of wheeled vehicles used by the South African Defence Forces. The G6 is armed with a 155mm gun related to the famous G5 artillery piece. It can outrange most artillery pieces of similar caliber. The crew is fully protected in an armored turret. A well-trained crew can fire about 4 rounds a minute. Prototype versions of the G6 have already seen combat action in southern Angola. The G6 is a particularly clear example of South Africa's unique approaches to armored combat vehicle design. The first armored cars were built in Europe, and not surprisingly, they are still being developed there. Italy has a long history of armored car design, from the early Ansaldos of World War I to the AB-41, so famous in the North African desert campaigns of World War II. In the 1990s, the Italian army turned to an armored car design to replace its dated M47 tanks. The new vehicle, called the Centauro, is designed as a tank destroyer.
In the case of the Italians, they have a deficiency in armoured vehicles, and they have decided to go for a whole fleet of wheeled vehicles, particularly the Simitar, which is an 8x8, very complicated tank destroyer, but it's very fast, is much faster than a tank, has the same firepower, but of course is on wheels, so it's got greater strategic mobility, so they can switch from one part of the country much quicker than the others. If they had tanks, they would need tank transporters and all the other parts that go with it, and that would be very expensive. But things like Simitar are very expensive because they have the same fire control system as a tank. In fact, what the Italians have tried to do is to a fleet of vehicles, all which share similar engines. I mean, the tank has a type of fire control system. The armoured car has the similar fire control system, as does the infantry fighter vehicle. So they have tried to save costs by having a common fire control system across the fleet.
The Centauro brigades are designed as the mobile reserve force of the Italian army. They are able to move from bases in central Italy to distant locations on a moment's notice to reinforce forward deployed Italian units. This role places an emphasis on firepower and mobility over armor. The Centauro's gun gives it the firepower to destroy most existing main battle tanks. Centauro units use tactics and terrain for protection rather than armor alone. As in the United States Army, the German Army relies primarily on tracked armored vehicles. But it does use wheeled armored vehicles in some specialized roles. The Fuchs is a chemical scout vehicle designed to locate and identify the enemy use of chemical warfare agents. The vehicle is hermetically sealed against outside agents, and it contains its chemical sensors inside. It has a special external probe which can be used to pick up contaminated material outside the vehicle and bring it into an interior compartment without exposing the crew. The chemical sensor equipment inside can distinguish between a variety of chemical warfare agents. France has been more active in wheeled armored vehicle design than nearly any other country in Europe. French armored cars have served with the French Army, and since the 1960s, many have been exported around the world, including the Panhard AML armored car. In the modern cavalry reconnaissance role, the French Army has adopted the AMX-10RC in recent years. Like the Centauro, it's armed with a 105mm gun. The AMX-10RC played a major part in France's commitment to Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The French Army has adopted a mixture of tracked and wheeled vehicles to transport its infantry in combat. The VAB is the wheeled element of this force. The VAB carries a standard infantry squad in the rear. It has been designed to carry a wide variety of weapons turrets, ranging from a machine gun turret to specialized missile turrets. The missile turret can include anti-tank missiles such as the HOT. The VAB was designed in a modular fashion to provide other configuration changes. The most radical of these is the VBC. It shares a common chassis with the VAB, but is a cavalry reconnaissance vehicle. Wheeled vehicles were the pioneers of the modern armored vehicle. From the chariots of ancient warriors to today's armored cars, mobile combat has always meant war on wheels.